Hi everybody, my name's Sean McDonald. I will be your moderator for this webinar over the next 40 to 45 minutes. The webinar today is titled Improving Board Effectiveness with an Annual Board Work Plan. Thanks for coming along today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here. During the session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering as many of these as we have time for as we go through the webinar. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as customary for our webinars, we've got a special treat for you. By answering a really short 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those that don't know Board Pro, we're a board software provider, sometimes referred to as a board portal. We serve around 20,000 users around the world in about 18 countries, I believe. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with clever software, of course, with less time, and deliver more impact and value for their organization. And as much as we're a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. Now, everything today, including the webinar recording, the presentation, the white paper, and the annual work plan templates, gosh, that's a mouthful, will be sent to you via email within the next 24 hours. So sit back, enjoy the conversation, and ask questions if you are so inclined. So let me introduce our panel for today. Stephen Bowman is our Managing Director of Conscious Governance and brings a real great depth of experience with board reviews and strategic planning. Stephen has a wealth of executive and governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy. Kia ora to you, Stephen. Giselle McLaughlin is a governance specialist in New Zealand with an eye on the strategic horizon, as well as on the ground just ahead. Giselle is all about down-to-earth governance and business advice and thrives on building sustainable businesses alongside healthy leaders and lives. Kia ora, Giselle.
Kia ora tātou, greetings everybody from Wanaka in New Zealand.
Linda Carroll is CEO of Align Group. Linda has over 20 years governance experience combined with over 30 years experience working with boards, CEOs and senior managers aligning strategy, governance, culture and performance. Linda's experience spans the wider state sector and non-profit sector boards, and she's also an accredited foresight practitioner through the Institute for the Future in California, United States. Kia ora to you, Linda.
Kia ora and welcome from Wellington in New Zealand.
So I shall hand over to you, Stephen, to start us off.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. So our topic today is, on the face of it, a very specific topic around annual board calendars. But what actually it is, it gets to the heart of why we have boards in the first place. It gets to the heart of what the work of a board should actually be focusing on. And one of the greatest and simplest tools that we can use is an annual board work calendar. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we've got Giselle and Linda there who've got enormous experience in working with boards and seeing some of the best examples of what boards are doing in this area. But the interesting thing is that I would say probably 80% of boards do not have an annual work calendar. They really don't. We do, as many of you have done yourselves, a governance review, and we do many governance reviews, and we would say probably about 80% don't have an annual work calendar. They might have the dates of their next board meeting, but that's about as far as they go.
So Stephen, it's probably just worth chipping in there in terms of the language we're using. So we've got on the slide the idea of the work plan. It is often used work calendar as well. And I think there can be a lot of confusion out in the market about what's the difference. So do you want to comment on that at all? And maybe we can tease that out a little bit.
In the end, it doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as it has both a work plan and a work calendar attached to it. So the notion here is that a calendar will have dates in there. It will have the scheduling that we need to. It will also have an update. It should have an update of some of the key topics that we're going to be talking about so that we have in advance as a calendar, in advance, we have knowledge of what are some of the topics that are going to be coming up so that we can prepare ourselves for it. Now, a work plan is one that will actually give us, here are the things that we need to make sure that we get through during the year. To me, I would use them. Which one do we use doesn't really matter. It's more importantly how you actually develop this up. Giselle?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the key thing that I encourage boards to do is to put the calendar in the work plan so that it's the same document.
One of the things we want to talk about is what does it actually, why do we have this work plan, this work calendar? And the main reason is to help us as a board focus on the things that we have to talk about. And the things that we have to talk about are often not what boards are actually talking about. How many times have you been to a board meeting where the first 45 minutes to an hour are taken up with papers for noting? We don't need to talk about them, but everyone introduces them. Or the CEO's report, for example, which has some fabulous stuff in there, but the CEO is then talking to their report when in fact there's nothing we need to do with it. So the structure of board meetings is not only within the board meeting itself, but also looking at what we need to do over a 12-month period, essentially a rolling 12-month period. And the most common complaint that we hear in any governance review is, oh, we need to be more strategic. Well, the issue is they've got no idea what that means. So what does that actually look like? We need to be more strategic. And there's always two elements here. One of them is within the board meeting itself. In fact, I'll say there's three elements. Within the board meeting itself, we need to structure our board meeting so it looks at these more far-reaching events, these things that are going to be creating the future. You know, our definition of strategic is very simple. It's a strategic plan, for example. What are these top 3 or 4 key things that we've got to get right in the next 2 or 3 years to make sure that we're actually delivering against our vision and that we are in good shape no matter what the future throws at us. So looking at this from the strategic point of view, one of them is the meeting itself, make sure that we've got the right material in there. The second element is us as directors personally being strategic. Are we willing to ask questions? Are we willing to look at things outside of just this board meeting? Are we willing to look to see what's happening into the future and what that might mean for us now? Are we willing to have those conversations? And then the third part is the actual calendar side of things. If we know that in 3 months' time, we're going to have a deep dive into the impact of artificial intelligence on board decision-making and organizational flow of work, then that gives me time as a director to actually do a bit of reading, to do a little bit of thinking about that. So if we look at strategy from those three things, strategy being strategic in the board meeting itself, strategy being me choosing to be strategic, and then strategy being looking at things that will be coming up into the future that have an impact on how we have discussions about how we create the future. Giselle?
Yeah, I think, and I'm thinking Linda probably would talk better than me on this point, but that all sounds very busy. So how much time has the board really got? Linda,
I think that's such a great point. And I think the thing is that it can be busy. And I don't like busy, I have to say. I don't like busy. I want intentional. And so if we actually think we don't really want to be busy, what we want to do is to intentionally work out when we need to carve out time in our board work plan to allow us to take the time to think. And I think that what Steve said about in the board meeting is important, because if you've got a really good work plan, then you work out, well, what time of year do we actually need to be thinking about strategy? And also when we're actually thinking about what's happening in the year, we also need to be thinking about when do we carve out the time that enables us to actually deal with those issues that blow up that maybe we don't know are coming down the pipeline towards us. We've got, obviously, when we're going to talk about risk and whatsoever on the board work plan, and when you're going to do your health and safety visits and the like, but you just have to carve out the time so you're not busy. So you're intentionally saying we need to leave sufficient time to think about the things that we consider to be important. And I love it. Sean's just popped this.
The elephant in the room often with boards is, I'm going to throw this one open to the panel now. How many board meetings should we have? Because after all, we're terribly busy. And if you want us to do all these extra things, then we should be having more board meetings. Okay,
Yeah.
now there's so many things wrong with that statement. So let's kick off. Giselle, do you want to kick this one off?
Yeah, so I'm a believer that less is more, but that doesn't mean shorter is more. I'm going to own the fact that I think meetings need to perhaps be investing a bit more time, but meeting less often. And that's something that I'm certainly discussing on, well, have implemented on the board that I'm currently chairing, but also I'm discussing that with a lot of boards, because my fundamental belief is if you meet monthly, you're going to be down in management, down in operations. I don't think that's an effective use of time. And I don't think it deals with this decision matrix at all. We spend time in the bottom line, not the top line.
But Giselle, we're so busy. Linda,
Yeah.
your turn.
I was just going to say, I think that it does really depend on what part of the cycle your business is in, or what is your business dealing with. So if you're actually involved in a board that is going through the organization is going through significant change, then there will be times when you think we've got a gap of 2 months, 3 months here. We might need to throw in a little short catch up to deal with that and that, just so the board is still across those key strategic risks and has an opportunity to hear how we're trending in those particular risks. So I agree with Giselle that it has to be appropriate to the organisation and appropriate to what the organisation's facing. And it doesn't mean you have to have a full meeting. You can have a 2-hour online catch up around the key risks, because otherwise are you actually fulfilling your governance responsibilities if you don't meet for 16 weeks? So I think you have to be careful about meeting monthly, as Giselle said. You don't just meet monthly because it's easier, because as you say, you don't want to get into the operations. You want to seek assurance and you want to make sure that you're doing your key governance responsibilities.
Yeah, and I'll just chip in from one of the Q&A comments. Thanks very much, Margaret Tipper, for this. A reminder that, of course, with everything in governance, we go back to the rules. And if your constitution or other foundation document says you need to meet a certain number of times a year, then you do need to do that. So yeah, never ever forget to check the foundation of your role at the board.
There's a couple of things with meetings in that the way to look at this from my point of view is to say, let's get our board meetings. If we're meeting 11 times a year, let's say, let's get our board meetings where they're really schmick, where we start off with the strategy stuff and we've developed up our board agenda so that there's very clearly those items that are for discussion and we allocate time for that, those items that are for decision and we have the time for that, and those items are for noting, we've actually taught ourselves not to talk about them, not to actually bring them up to relitigate them as part of the board conversation. So if we can get that right, and then we start to look at having a board calendar that says, okay, so here are some of the things that we need to talk about as the year goes on, and here's roughly where we're going to do these. Then you can start to look at, do we actually need 11 meetings a year now? Because if you get your meetings where they need to be, you will find that there's less busy work that needs to be done. And just some very simple techniques that you can use tomorrow to help get you to that stage where your meetings are more effective, more efficient. They're actually helping you create the future and not just monitoring how busy the staff are. 2 really great techniques. Number 1 is 2 or 3 days before a board meeting, allocate a half hour where the CEO and the chair are available, and directors can call in with any issues of clarification they might have. They might want to know more about something, or I need a bit more information on this, or I wasn't quite sure what this meant. Those things shouldn't occur at the board meeting. They should be developed prior to the board meeting. So many boards that do this have said that they found it works really well. You allocate a half hour, directors call in if they've got an issue where they want it to be clarified or more information sent out. And then the most important thing is that the chair then contacts all directors and tells them what the question was, what the clarification was, so that everyone has the same information.
Or we could even record it and then flick that out. So, Stephen, I just wanted to pick up on this slide. So we've got, to take your point, you're talking about the strategic thinking piece. It's important, but not urgent. I want to acknowledge as well, one of the chats that's come through to us as hosts talking about your favorite topic, which is the consent agenda, where everybody takes all the noting items, notes them up front, and we just move on from them. Yeah, just thanks very much for the prompt, Sarah, but you're preaching to the converted on that. I know Stephen's a real big fan.
We have a couple of questions here.
So I just wanted to quickly cover off on this slide though, Sean, then I'll hand over to you if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Just this, I want to put a special plug in for the people and culture leadership responsibilities of the board, because so often a board annual work plan is very focused on processes and paperwork, delegations and so on, but the boards forget to make time for not only the CEO or GM sort of performance engagement, if you like, from beginning to end, but the real role of how do we lead the culture of this organization? Where does that fit in our strategy? What can we do to help? Thinking about succession planning, all of those things are huge opportunities for the board to have a very positive impact, and often left out of the annual work plan. Sean.
Thank you for that. So we have a couple of questions that have come in, one from Simon McManus. What tools do you recommend for keeping things moving in between board meetings so that board meetings can be strategically focused rather than overly focused on operations?
Mm-hmm. So I'll just put a plug in for Teams right away, having a board group for Teams, or a board and management group, or both, where small things can be managed and dealt with. Yep, that's an easy answer, something like Teams.
To me, the most important part in this is the quality of the board reports coming up to the board. It's a whole different topic, but in essence, summarising it, more is not better. What we need to be able to do with our board reports coming to the board is to be very clear to our audience, which are the directors, what are those items that we need to make decisions around? Now, what are the options that we've got around those decisions that we need to make? So that's your paper for decision. Paper for discussion needs to have some information in there so that directors can start to get themselves ready so they can have powerful discussions. And particularly when you do a discussion paper, put in there a heading that says something like strategic questions for board consideration. I guarantee that'll get the discussion going, rather than people putting out their, here's my line in the sand, this is how I think the world should be sort of conversation. The other thing is that most board reports are pretty horrible. I've got to say, we see thousands and thousands of them during the year. And the reason they're pretty horrible is that because writers of the board report are typically staff or board committees, and they're not really taking into account who their audience is and what the audience needs to know from that particular report. Number one. Number two, typically directors are always going to say, give me more information, give me more information, I need more information. And that really is not the answer to any of this. So what information do we need to be able to make the choices that we need to make? That should be the overarching, tattooed key mantra for anyone who's writing a board report. And one of my favorite visuals that I bring up, and some of you may not know this, but look it up on the internet. I want to know, where's Wally? I want to know, in amongst this board report, what do I need to focus on? Where is Wally? Where? Don't make me search for him. Give it right up front.
But sometimes that's exactly the point. The management have hidden Wally in a great deal of depth. And if you want a good illustration of that, then recent report done for New Zealand's Reserve Bank on the Westpac New Zealand operations risk governance is a fantastic read. 10 pages. It is dense, but it's a really good read. I do want to just ask people if you can put your comments or questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, because in the chat only we can see it. Whereas if you do the Q&A, then it's, I think, publicly available. So
I'll read out a couple of these as we have time for. Ruth Millard has said, what is your thoughts on executive summaries to capture the highlights of the board package?
I'll just give my views on that. One of my pet things that I find really frustrating is when I get an executive summary that is 2 pages, and then I get the report and I actually get exactly the same paragraph, word perfect, from the executive summary in the actual report. And there's no point. If you're going to give an executive summary, which I think is actually quite helpful because it helps with the where's Wally, then make it a really tight, short executive summary that enables a board director to basically see what they actually need to be looking for in the content of the report. But honestly, don't do the repetitive thing, because I just end up reading the same thing twice and thinking, what am I missing here? Is there something different?
Rachel,
I'm going to just build on that. I think this is something I've never thought of before, but if we're being really intentional, which is our flavor of this whole webinar, I think there's an opportunity to get away from the CE report piece only, for the CE or chair to write an executive summary for the pack, not a report. It's almost like
I like that.
letter of introduction to guide the board about, rather than saying to them all, read the agenda to find out where we're going to spend our time, why wouldn't the chair actually send a brief summary that says, I'm expecting that these are the big issues of the meeting, and you'll see there's some very information or whatever, just like it's a warm introduction to help people to get their mind aligned without telling them what to think.
We had a very good example with a very large, huge company in Qatar we were working with, where the chair would start off each meeting with a very quick 2-minute summary of the 2 things he wanted to make sure that we got through during this upcoming meeting. And they weren't necessarily board work related. They were typically all around occupational health and safety, which was really interesting because that was his cultural take on things. And they would even start off board meetings with a story from someone in the trenches about how they went over and above what their job role was in occupational health and safety. And they celebrated that to make the point to the directors, this was just so important. So it can be used from a cultural perspective as well too. And this gave me goosebumps watching the chair do this. He was very good at it.
we have a few more questions here to come through. First one from Rachel. I'll try and get this right. I'm not quite sure of the wording, but Rachel asks, does the Constitution indicate online or in-person meetings? This may also dictate the type of collaboration, risk, problems to resolve or discuss. Comments on that, Linda?
Yes, the Constitution may actually, in the past, not have indicated virtual meetings, but now it would be, I think, quite unusual for boards not to be taking up the option to meet virtually, and that does need to be reflected in the Constitution or in the subcommittee terms of reference as well, if you have subcommittees.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a standard clause these days. If it's not there, then your Constitution hasn't been reviewed since the 1950s. And that happens.
Margaret's just commented, she's saying the Corporations Act in Australia allows for this. Oh, Cecil's just asked, could you please repeat the best example of a board report?
Yeah, I think Cecile is my guess, and I'm not quite sure if we covered that. I was looking at that question myself. So I don't think we actually said what the best example of a board
I didn't
report
think so either.
But what we did talk about was, if you have an executive summary, then at the front, then don't repeat that.
No, you did. Giselle, you did. You talked about the New Zealand Reserve Bank Westpac report.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, okay. So it was a report done for the New Zealand Reserve Bank on Westpac New Zealand, if that's what you're looking for.
Here's another little tip for people on this very subject. And that is, and this is often not done. When you've got a report going to the board, that might be a report that is for noting or for information only, but there's something in there that you want them to talk about, pull it out as a separate briefing paper. Don't make them go through the whole report and then you want them to talk about a particular element. So the key trick will have, if it's a paper for noting or for information, but there's something in there that is worthy of discussion, don't alert people to, on page 15, we actually want to talk about that. Pull it out as a separate briefing paper, a one-pager. So it's very clear that we need to have our attention on this particular element. Same thing with the CEO's report or the executive report. If there's something in there that you want the board to talk about, pull it out as a separate briefing paper. Don't make them flip through the 15 pages virtually to get to that one part you want them to talk about.
Susan Laguna's asked, do you suggest we do a planning meeting with the staff and board together to save time with them working in groups? Yeah.
I quite like the idea. I quite like the idea of having the board actually have a conversation with the senior executives about what are the key areas that are coming up over the next 12 months. And then whoever puts the board calendar together, usually it would be the company secretary. And that's another conversation if we want to have, is the role of the company secretary.
Yeah.
Stephen, we have a couple of examples of work plans coming up. Do you want to switch to those and have a talk about those?
Probably not yet.
Okay.
We'll cover that in a sec, Giselle.
So I just wanted to cover off this bottom point that we've got on the slide. So we're talking about that the work plan items should occupy as much as 60% of every meeting. So what we're signaling there, if it's on the plan, it should be important, needs to be done, and then the meetings should be dealing with important things. So in a way, what we're really saying on this slide is it should all add up. It should make logical sense where we spend our time, but allowing the board the agility that they need to manage the unexpected in a planned way, if that makes any sense.
Linda, anything to add on that? You're on mute.
No, I think Giselle actually does that really nicely. Well done.
Cool. So the whole thing behind a board work plan, there is no one way of doing it. I think, Sean, if we can go to those examples now and actually talk through the logic behind them. So please don't feel that you have to read all of this. You'll get this as part of the pack. But these are different types of board work plans, board calendars. This one was quite good because it essentially had a Gantt chart type feel to it. And it allocated areas into risk management, compliance, different areas. So you can actually start to look at, we've got some really good stuff on strategy in here, but nowhere are we talking about risk. Is that something we need to add in there? Also, as part of this, it has the calendar part. So it tells when we need to start planning for certain things. So it gives directors a heads up of what's likely to be coming up. Next one, Sean.
Can I just comment on two things on this one? So if I'm working with a board to do this, then at the very top where we've got the months, I would also have the date, the duration of the meeting, and its location, so online or head office or whatever. So that gets you your calendar and board plan in one place. If we just go back, Sean, I just wanted to pick up on one small thing. The one thing I noticed about this plan that I really liked was that each item was not allocated to a single month necessarily. It acknowledges that things take time. So if you look at the AGM 2022 planning about 2/3 of the way down, it's there for 3 months and then we do have the AGM. And I really liked that. I think often boards run out of time because they haven't done that cascading of the work over the time it takes. And I just wanted to acknowledge how smart that was.
So we move on to the next one. And these are just different styles. These are all real life board calendars from boards. So this was an example. And again, if we take up what Giselle and Linda were saying before too, is put the dates and the times in there as well too. You may as well make it as a calendar. But this one I quite liked as well too, because it clearly showed what were compliance issues that they needed to deal with. And they did that in different colors. And also had in there things like reviewing of the strategic plan and so on. But these are just examples. If you went on and did a Google search on board work calendars, there'd be a whole lot that would be available online as well too. But the key thing in any board work plan and calendar is that the board works its way through it. As you'll see in the white paper, one of the most powerful statements in there is the very act of creating a board work calendar is 80% of the value of it. Linda?
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that we also do is we schedule on the work plan for the board when we're having our subcommittee meetings. So we have 3 subcommittees and we schedule those in so that you can actually see the flow of work for the whole board, including its subcommittees. And you can also see when the subcommittee is going to be reporting back. For example, the People Culture Subcommittee deals with the Chief Executive's performance, and therefore that timing is really critical in terms of when the quarterly reports come out on performance of the company and when you schedule your People and Culture Subcommittee. So those sorts of flow-on effects can then be very clearly and nicely articulated and shown in a picture.
And I have one sitting to my left-hand side over here this is a big shout out to Sunbury Cobble Community Health, one of the best organisations I've had the pleasure of coming across. And they have an annual board work calendar, which is just awesome because everything is colour-coded. Everything for their boards, subcommittees, they're color-coded. They're in there as well too. They have many things of what that subcommittee needs to look at during the year, and it's all on 2 pages. So it just, this can be very simple, but the intellect that goes into it is incredibly powerful. Sean, have we got another one on there? I'm not sure if we had.
We sure do. I'll just hang it up.
I just wanted to pick up on what you just said then, Stephen. I think that people often underestimate how much time and energy and intellect needs to go into this planning. It's not something that the chair can completely delegate. It's not something that management should leave to the chair either. This is a really significant piece, a key ingredient of the board's success. And then the board needs to actually own it. And one of the things when I talked to do director training is, so this is not just the chair's document, this belongs to every board member, and they are all responsible for making sure that they're on track with their plan. Very easy to treat it as a piece of admin, but it is absolutely not that. It is your roadmap for your work.
The one we've got up on screen now is just an example of, if we can do it for the board, why don't we do it for our committees as well, so that they've got an idea of what's coming up during the year. So this is an example of a governance committee work plan that I came across quite recently. But what I quite like it about this is here's the duties, here's what we need to do. Here are the tasks. This is the start date and the due date for it. And here's the current status. It's pretty good. So it gives us, we're not meeting just because we have to meet. This is actually our plan for the year. So again, these are just examples of the thinking that can go behind a annual board work calendar or work plan that enables us as a board to really make the best use of the time that we are choosing to actually do our job as a board. So Giselle, do you have anything else you'd like to add that what are some of the 2 big things that you found that boards don't do with their annual work calendar that if they were to do it would actually really add value?
The first thing that they do is to do it once and then put it in the drawer, metaphorically speaking. So I'm a believer in the board work plan goes in every board pack because that's the accountability that the board is having. And the other is having it as a boring, old-fashioned document instead of something that's modern, digital, and flexible.
Yeah. Linda?
One of the things that I found is working with boards is they don't have one at all. And then the complete other side is they have one that says that's basically an agenda for every meeting. It's so detailed and it's so rigid that they have no agility to deal with the things that will crop up through the year. It has to be just the key things that have to be dealt with. Don't fall into the trap of having an agenda for every meeting as your board work plan.
A couple of more questions that have come in here. Let me take, there's another one come through from Grant Henderson. Grant asks, is the planning of board work documents typically based on a calendar year or a financial year? That's a good question.
Great question. You can do either. So I'm a believer in financial year because it keeps everybody looking forward. And so on that, a really small plug for setting board dates on a rolling even 3 months ahead, or not. So 12 months plus 3 months, if you like. So you're always moving ahead a year, not that you get to December and set the board's dates for the following year.
Deborah Doughton is in London at the moment. Gosh, it must be late up there at the moment. Deborah says, I'm sorry I was late tuning in. Was there a recommendation for how you determine how many meetings to have each year?
I wanted to circle back to the meeting things because this is the big hot chestnut that boards talk about all the time. Let me give you some little hints on this one. There is no right, there is no wrong. I've seen some very sophisticated boards meet 11 times a year, but they use those meetings for different purposes. I've seen some very unsophisticated boards meet 11 times a year. I've seen some very unsophisticated boards meet 3 times a year, and even they're a waste of time. So it's really what we choose to do with it. But here's a little hint that I found that if boards pick up on this can make a huge difference. And that hint is this. Let's say you run 10 meetings a year or 11 meetings a year. Allocate 2 of those to a deep dive into a strategic issue. Not agendaed, no board work. We don't then go into a little bit mini board meeting afterwards because we had to get some things signed. No, this is an allocation of 2.5, 3, 4 hours of what would normally have been a board meeting, but we're allocating that for a deep dive into artificial intelligence, or we're allocating a deep dive into data response and cybersecurity, or a deep dive into changing stakeholder engagement actions and insights that we're having, so that we plan this in advance. So what happens is that, in fact, your board meetings reduce down to about 8, but we're still meeting, but they have different purpose behind them, not just the same old of board run by a board agenda. Giselle, Linda, thoughts, please?
Yeah, I thought I would pick up the other 2 questions, which is on this point. So we've got question, having all directors buying into the board calendar and the actions can be difficult at times. And then someone else, I think Agnes Valkany, key messages for company secretaries is her question. So I think we take these 2 together and recognize that whether it's the company secretary or the chair or a CEO type role, the position of coordinating this is incredibly important, and you need to do it with influence. Bring people with you. And how do you do that? You've got to create the time and space and inspire them with your excellent work.
I agree.
I'd give a shout out to everyone who has a company secretary. Support them in training. Send them off to your country's company secretaries association to get training in how to be a really good company secretary. Because these days it's not secretarial, it's governance support, and that's absolutely crucial. Linda?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, you know, the chair's role and relationship with the chief executive is really important, but it also is really important in terms of the company secretary. And one of the ways that I work with regards to getting the board engagement and commitment to the annual board work plan is to make it a little bit of a front end in our board only time. At a certain time every little while is actually to spend time looking at, as a board, what do we want to do in terms of, are we still okay when we're looking at the next 3 months beyond what we've planned? Is there anything we need to do differently, or anything that was a problem that we need to fix? Say, for example, the timing of the annual report or something. Just being aware and intentional at engaging your board and doing the planning, because it's their plan.
Fabulous.
One last comment I'll make before we finish up here, and this could be probably the most controversial thing I've said, and that is, at law, the chair owns the board agenda. So we know that. And it's been tested under common law in all sorts of jurisdictions that the chair owns the agenda, not the board, not the directors. Now, no one has yet talked about, this would be an article for you, Giselle, no one's yet talked about who owns the board work calendar. And my suggestion would be that the chair owns it, with all of the input from the others. But if you can't get buy-in from a director for that board work calendar, tough. Then either as a director, you get behind it, or you think that this is not the right board for you. One of the things I think sometimes is we're way too democratic at times when it comes to things like board agendas. And we've got to have input, but in the end, if you've got a really good chair, and every chair should do the chairing course of some sort in an organization. One of the things we always recommend is the chairs of all subcommittees should go off and do a one-day chairing course, because the content may not be great, but they're going to mix it with a whole lot of other chairs over that day, and they'll be talking, and they'll have people they can contact afterwards. So get involved and actually learn some of these skills. And if we do that, then we start to find that a good chair is going to listen to all their directors, but also takes responsibility. Linda?
Look, I agree that the chair has to take responsibility, but it's also about what's your board dynamics, what's the board culture that you want. And at the end of the day, people are much more likely to buy into something if you engage them early in it. So that's just the way I roll.
Yeah. And I've got another suggestion for a webinar topic, Sean. Chairing a board, democracy or dictatorship?
Excellent.
And we
Nice
can
topic.
put Linda and Steve on either
The
side.
answer will be yes.
All right. So I'd like to point out some of the other topics for webinars, given that we're on this track. We've got some really cool stuff coming through. I'll draw your attention to number 49, AI Essentials for Governance. As much as there is technology before that, which we're going to do a nice deep dive on, we have Steve Norrie, who is probably the foremost expert in the AI world. He has about 1.5 million LinkedIn followers. He's going to be joining us with Stephen to talk about the AI essentials for governance. So I'd strongly recommend you put that one in your diaries. The next one coming up, of course, is 7 costly mistakes of board packs and how to fix them. As I mentioned in my opening, you'll receive an email which will include a copy of the recording, the presentation slides, the white paper, and the annual work plan templates from Steve. Now, just as you leave, don't forget to complete the 1-minute survey, go into the draw for our $400 hamper, which is very nice. We'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar later on today. Excuse me. So thanks again, everybody, for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thanks, Stephen, Giselle, and Linda. We're looking forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar on April the 6th, Diversity of Thought. Could this be your next board superpower, led by Lloyd Mander, supported by Dr. Susan Mravlik and Paul Smith from Future Directors, 3 of the top experts in this topic area. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.